It was 1962, the height of the Cold War, a time during which the world superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, competed to spread their political ideologies. The Berlin Wall had just been erected a few months after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion the year before, increasing the already strained tensions between the two countries. It came as a shock, then, when Russia made their boldest move yet. On October 14th, just after 9 a.m., American reconnaissance photographed something completely unexpected: the transportation of fighter jets, arms, and other unknown objects suspected to be nuclear weapons to Cuba. This marked the beginning of the most suspenseful 13 days in U.S. history. During the Cold War, the U.S. had a significant advantage over the USSR due to the 45 Jupiter missiles and 200 ICBMs placed right at their doorstep in Turkey. Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet chairman, complained once, "We see ourselves surrounded by U.S. military bases," and believed his next act would give them a taste of their own medicine. Communist Cuba, under the reign of Fidel Castro, struck a revolutionary deal with Khrushchev. The contents of this deal? To place nuclear weapons within Cuba. Cuba's apprehension for another U.S. invasion would abate. The Soviets would have missiles within minutes from Washington and a major communist ally in the Americas. Execution of this plan began in July, and by October, reports and sightings came from within CIA networks, along with U-2 photographs, all of which clearly showed missile construction. Though the president and his advisors were skeptical at first, actions had to be taken. JFK resultantly called together the highly secretive Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to act on all the crisis events, which consisted of a dozen of Kennedy's most trusted political advisors. When Robert Kennedy, Attorney General and sibling to JFK, confronted Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, he denied missile presence. After hours of debate, the committee was left with two courses of action: an airstrike on the missile sites or a naval blockade. The trick here was not power, as each side could easily kill millions, but the political and psychological effects of each side's decisions. In the end, the president chose the expressive, yet less belligerent show of force. On October 22nd, Kennedy and his council decided on a naval quarantine of Cuba, although in practice it was essentially a blockade. Preparing for the worst reaction by the Soviets, the Joint Chief of Staffs raised the alarm level to DEFCON 3. That day, Kennedy went public, messaging Khrushchev to remove all Soviet presence from Cuba and delivering a TV address to the U.S. public regarding the standoff, warning Russians of the dangerous consequences they would face if missile construction continued. The rest of the U.S. was shivering in fear of nuclear war. The conflict had escalated, and the trial to come would test the resolve, strength, empathy, and leadership of both sides.
The nation is prepared to present its case against the Soviet threat to peace and our own proposals for a peaceful world at any time and in any forum. This sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country.
The following day, Premier Khrushchev sent a brief letter of disapproval of U.S. actions, stating, "I should say frankly that measures outlined in your statement represent a serious threat to peace and security of peoples. I hope the U.S. will show prudence and renounce actions pursued by you, which could lead to catastrophic consequences." Nonetheless, his actual reaction was far different. Khrushchev, at all costs, wanted to avoid nuclear war just as Kennedy did. At that moment, he was both relieved of the relatively calm U.S. reaction to the situation, yet concerned that JFK knew of their presence. He hastened missile site completion and put troops on combat readiness. On October 25th, Kennedy finally decided it was time for public confrontation on the world stage. At 5 p.m. Eastern Time, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin in a Security Council meeting, in one of the most iconic moments of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I've ever heard it said that the crime is not the burglar, but the discovery of the burglar. And that the threat is not the clandestine missiles in Cuba, but their discovery and the limited measures taken to quarantine further infection. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room, which you can all examine at your leisure. Shows 3 successive photographic enlargements of another missile base of the same type in the area of San Cristobal.
Then came the day aptly known as Black Saturday, the 27th of October. First, an American U-2 spy plane was shot over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, leading to the death of the pilot. XCOM members, infuriated, suggested retaliation on the site, and American troops were put on DEFCON 2 readiness, one step away from war. At the same time, Khrushchev was furious, ordering that no shots be fired without his command. Equally unnerving, a Soviet submarine armed with nuclear torpedoes was inadvertently hit with test U.S. depth charges. The crew, mentally exhausted and cut off from contact with Moscow, thought war had begun. If Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet officer aboard, had agreed to launch the torpedo like his two fellow officers, war would have ensued. Doomsday seemed imminent, but Kennedy and Khrushchev were still pushing for a diplomatic resolution. Khrushchev gave a long, emotional speech, stating, "If there is no intention to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the end of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this," and sent an equally passionate and philosophical statement highlighting the prodigious risk of this conflict. On this day, the Soviets proposed a compromise ensuring the safety of both countries. As long as America promised not to invade Cuba, they'd withdraw their missiles. Robert Kennedy later secretly met with Anatoly Doberman, agreeing to the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey as well, provided it was kept secret. But the crisis did not end there. Castro, needless to say, was irate at Khrushchev by the removal of missiles, and preventing him from making rash decisions was a problem in itself. The quarantine continued until November 20th, when the Soviets finally removed their offensive missiles under UN inspection. The crisis was over, with world destruction missed by a hair. Kennedy's image both domestically and internationally improved, and lessened the world's resentment from the Bay of Pigs invasion. On the other hand, Khrushchev's reputation deteriorated, leading to China breaking off relations with the USSR and Khrushchev's resignation in 1964. At great political cost, he did not mention Turkey's missiles. Whatever it may seem, the foresight and vigilance of these two men, along with their willingness to put nuclear war prevention before their country's needs, was integral in preventing conflict. Everyday human deficiencies such as stress could have led to war, but the advisors on each side knew the impact of their decisions and used communication to effectively avert disaster. At the XCOM table, every member's rank was not taken into account, only their proven acumen. The fate of the world rested on these shoulders and their thoughtful debates, compromises, and decisions.
They now generally agree that this was the single most dangerous moment in recorded history. This was an event in which, as President Kennedy said privately to his brother during the event, that the chances that this would go to war, up into and including nuclear war, was somewhere between 1 in 3.
From the crisis, both countries had learned the importance of putting themselves in other nations' shoes, because their actions could have an effect on the world for generations to come. With such a narrow gap between total world destruction, countries around the globe realized something had to be done about this. The White House and the Kremlin established a direct communications line known as the Hotline to mitigate such a situation again. This new mentality also led to the ratification of the treaty banning nuclear weapons tests in 1963, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, which vastly decreased the spread of nuclear weapons, and indirectly led to the SALT I Treaty ratified in 1972. Most importantly, it contributed to the start of Detente, an era of decreasing tensions between the two superpowers, which led to greater prosperity and more peace negotiations throughout the world. In modern times, the fear of nuclear war from mutually assured destruction lives on today. In recent light of North Korean possession of nuclear weapons, the fear of devastation is manifesting again, as war would be certain if they fired a single missile. Fortunately, history has taught world leaders the significance of diplomacy and how to avert conflict through compromise. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a tale of diplomacy, prudence, and perspective, an event which rippled through the delicate fabric of foreign relations, intertwining the unity of the nations we live amongst for years to come.